In 2008, Christopher Nolan and Warner Brothers pulled off what is, to my mind, one of the greatest advertising build-ups to a movie ever with The Dark Knight. It had viral marketing, trailers, TV spots, posters, tie-in movies, and an extensive home media re-release of Batman Begins. But perhaps the most impressive element of that campaign to me was when the first 6 minutes of the film was released on IMAX screens. The introduction to the Joker and the bank heist contained just enough action, plot buildup, and intrigue without truly spoiling the movie that I felt it was one of the greatest advertising moves I had ever seen. It was so memorable that Nolan repeated it 4 years later with The Dark Knight Rises, which is, in my humble opinion, an even better sequence. Certainly film trailers and traditional marketing campaigns have their place, but it has always made me wonder, what would it be like if a movie just relied on the opening to bring in people, rather than countless trailers and TV YouTube spots? There is no better example of attention-grabbing intros for a film franchise than James Bond. When a Bond film comes around, everybody knows not to be late, so as to not miss a thrilling spectacle that often ranks as some people's favorite part of the movie. These intros are jammed-packed with action, though some throw in a bit of plot setup and character development so as to set the status quo for the film. Yet they don't all follow the same formula. Some are nothing but a disconnected bit of action. Others are short sequences of intrigue that sets up things to come, and most try to blend them both. This probably goes without saying, but this is by far the hardest challenge I've given myself with this series yet, as there is no official pre-title I actively dislike. Even the lowest still has a lot going for it. And so, after rewatching all of the pre-titles back to back in preparation for this video, I ended up rewatching some of them again because I was second-guessing my placements by the end. A lot of them are so good that I was left stumped for a bit. And this is with a series where I've seen all the films more times than I care to admit. So please keep that in mind as we go through each of these. If anything, I hate that I can't place most of them in the top 10. Anywho, enough with my first world problems. Let's see what intro clambered its way to the top.
Bond? Yes? I'm Lieutenant Mathis of the Special Police.
Obviously, since neither Dr. No nor Never Say Never Again have pre-title sequences, we can begin this list with the unofficial Casino Royale. I'm not ranking this one at the bottom because it's not a great piece of action or suspense like the Eon films. This is Charlie Feldman's Casino Royale, so obviously it plays by different rules. No, my problem with it is that if you're gonna do a non-sequitur joke to open the film, why this one? Sure, it sets up that we are in a farce, and I absolutely think that's the way to go here, but the first joke really needs to land with the audience. And while doing a dick joke is fine, I guess, there are so many other better jokes throughout the film you could have used. Since this opening is meant to parody the almost detached nature of the pre-title sequences from the official series, you could have picked virtually anything else from the film and it would have served the same purpose. So that's my issue. It's just an okay bit, and whatever you think about this film, I think we can agree there are certainly better jokes later.
Whose funeral is it?
Yours.
Live and Let Die boldly begins a Bond film without even an image of our hero until after the titles. It instead sets up the three murders that caused 007 to investigate the mystery around Kananga. And while I love starting off a film with some intrigue, I think my big hang-up is that there's nothing really stand out about the scene beyond how low-key it is. There's no great moment, no magnificent stunt, or great villain setup. If you didn't have the gun barrel at the beginning, you could have placed this scene at the beginning of any other murder mystery from the 70s and it would play exactly the same. I do like some things about it, such as the jazz funeral and the voodoo ceremony, both of which come back later in the film. To repeat my earlier point, it's not that this is a badly done sequence, it's just unfortunate that it has to compete with all of the other films, and so it can't help but fade into the background. Sorry, mate. I love the movie, though.
Why do Chinese girls taste different from all other girls?
You think we better, huh?
No, just different.
With both the capture of a space vessel and the death of Bond, you'd think this would be a showstopper of an opening. Yet, even amongst these 60s Bond films, You Only Live Twice's pre-titles just feels lackluster. I think the first half is the stronger bit, notwithstanding the dodgy visual effects. We aren't given any clues as to who perpetuated this theft, but we are given the stakes up front. One more incident like this could very easily lead to open war. But it's when we move to the second half that I have issues. Not only is teasing the death of Bond not unique in this series, we had already seen 2 of the previous 4 films that did this, but once you put the sequence in context with the rest of the film, it diminishes its power. Bond faking his own death really goes nowhere and ultimately is just here to have the title make sense. It's not as if Bond doesn't still have Spectre agents pursuing him throughout the investigation, so I'm not sure it provided him as much breathing room as M had hoped for. On its own, it's an okay start, but once pieced together with the rest of the movie, it suffers.
Molly. Ask Molly.
Who are you?
My name is Bond. James Bond.
Diamonds Are Forever has always been a tricky animal, as it sets up expectations that it doesn't deliver on. I always felt it made more sense as a direct follow-up to Twice, given how it virtually ignores Majesties, yet the intensity of Bond's search for Blofeld momentarily makes you think Diamonds is going to be the revenge story that Majesties set up. I really do love this first bit, but once it quiets down to Bond finally finding Blofeld and the discussion of the double, it feels like we just had the rug pulled out from under us. Even if you did not like Majesties and wanted a revenge thriller like I did, I imagine the tone shift is pretty jarring to you too. It's not that I don't enjoy anything from the second part. I love Bond's flippancy and the mousetrap, but the fight isn't all that special and Blofeld is given such a disappointing end. Granted, this is not the real Blofeld, but we might not know that on our first watch. Everything just feels a little off here, and so while I truly love that first bit, the sequence as a whole is one of the least impressive of the series.
I thought you'd never get back.
Well, there was a heck of a crowd on the piece.
So I see.
There are 2 reasons why A View to a Kill's opening is this low. The first is that stupid song, which ruins some great action. The second is that the coda with Bond in the sub with the woman feels half-hearted and so routine. It's not nearly as charming or sexy as the film thinks it is. Putting those 2 things aside, I really like this sequence. Bond finding the body of a fellow 00 and the somber nature of the moment is welcome. The ski action is solid, and I like how it's markedly different than previous Willy Bogner sequences, both in the way it's shot and how it's staged. I love that Bond progresses from skis to snowmobile to snowboard and finally on foot. This is a great way to keep the scene building. And it introduces the best piece of music in the film with John Barry's excellent action theme. Man, if those 2 hang-ups of mine weren't here, this one would be a lot higher. But while I can somewhat forgive the coda and the sub, I mean, I don't like it much, but I can see how others might, given that it's a very Bondian situation. The attempt at humor is really hard to look past.
Bravo, Monsieur Scaramanga. You've done it again.
One of the better non-Bond sequences, Golden Gun's opening focuses on building up the main villain, and it's a good choice. The funhouse is established, as well as Scaramanga's character and his and Knick-Knack's strange rivalry, all of which will play a part in the finale. It makes for a great bookend to the film, and I love seeing a gangster put through the ringer in such a strange and fantastical place. It's filled with misdirection and jump scares so as to get the contender to empty his clip. This fits perfectly into Scaramanga's tendency to not play fair and fabricates for him an edge he doesn't actually earn. Don't get me wrong, I still believe Scaramanga would have bested most other gunmen in a fair duel, but I love seeing this arrogance in his supposed supremacy is his undoing when Bond steps into the ring later. My gripes with this sequence are with some of the presentation. How come it seems the gangster can't see exactly where Scaramanga went nor see his hand go up for the gun cage? Plus, the insert shot of Scaramanga going for the gun in the mirror is a little odd when mixed in with the rest of the footage. All that said, this is a solid opening to the film, and had the rest of the movie resembled the fun of these cat and mouse games in the funhouse, I probably would love the film even more.
Exactly 1 minute 52 seconds. That's excellent.
Now that we've gotten through the more iffy or flawed openings, we are squarely in the group of scenes where I could see any of them being in a top 10 list, and the only reasons some aren't are mostly personal hangups, nitpicks, or preferences. From Russia with Love was the first Bond film to open with a pre-title sequence, and so there was no precedent to compare it with. Much like Golden Gun, it focuses on setting up a villain and his skill set before the eventual confrontation with Bond, and I love how economical this scene is. There's no fat to be trimmed here, and it's very effective in its goals. It's basically the fact that so many other great sequences came afterwards that just does not rank higher. As much as I love cat and mouse games, I'll always prefer some stellar action. It just gets me more invested right off the bat. Plus, I've personally always disliked how this film simply fades in and out of the sequence. Starting with Thunderball, all the pre-titles feel more natural in their integration with both the gun barrel and the opening titles, often with an iris out or a dissolve. Regardless, Russia has a solid opening that wonderfully signals what kind of film this is going to be.
Madame, I've come to offer my sincere condolences.
As I said, I think Thunderball is the true blueprint for the rest of the pre-titles to come. When you talk about the Bond pre-titles with casual fans and the general public, they'll often describe them as fun action pieces that have nothing to do with the rest of the film. However, Thunderball's opening with Bond killing Jacques Bouvard is not only mentioned later in the film, but it also establishes that Bond is continuing to run into the Spectre group who we last saw in Russia. So it mixes fun action with some plot setup, like 80% of the Bond films do. The highlight of this sequence is Bond using the jetpack, which was quite a startling surprise in the 60s, though even today, I don't know that many would have expected Bond to have had access to one of these. I can understand if the jetpack is overboard for some. It does feel like it comes out of left field when placed with the rest of the sequence, but one of the rules about the classic run of Bond films is entertainment over realism. This is certainly not going to be to everyone's taste, but I love the jetpack so much for this era of Bond that I'm happy to roll with it. When you get down to it, Thunderball's opening is a wild ride, and that's exactly what I want from classic Bond.
This is where we leave you, Mr. Bond.
A little premature, isn't it?
Oh boy, Moonraker has a heck of an opening action scene. Bond falling out of a plane without a parachute. This is terrific stuff. And despite how obvious the insert shots are mixed in with the doubles, I'm having so much fun that I do not care. Moonraker is obviously building off of the template established by The Spy Who Loved Me's opening, right down to using the same basic setup of the plot. But I'm impressed with how you can get the same points across in a shorter amount of time, though I prefer drawing out the suspense a little more. However, I am ignoring the elephant in the room, which is of course the reason this isn't in the top 10. I'm sorry, but ending the scene with a really unfunny gag of Jaws plummeting through the circus tent kills this for me. I get that he is Jaws and the most durable of henchmen, but if Bond was supposed to be in true peril only moments ago, juvenile gags like this not only sour the fun, but it makes the danger feel inauthentic. Obviously, neither Bond or Jaws are going to die in the opening 10 minutes, But if Jaws can survive the fall due to plot armor, why can't Bond? I'm sorry, if the sequence just ended in some other way, I'd be happy to place this one towards the top.
Good afternoon, Mr. Bond. Don't concern yourself with the pilot, one of my less useful people.
For a long time, I thought For Your Eyes Only had one of my favorite openings. Yet, when compared to the rest of this list, I found that it just came lower. I don't want to downplay how much I love this sequence. Opening on Tracy's grave, the remote control helicopter with Bond on the outside, the downright thrilling music, it's a spectacular opening to the film. However, I will say that the sequence suffers from some of the same problems as the rest of the movie. It wants to get back to the more grounded thrills of the past, and yet it still contains some of the trademark Roger Moore silliness. Don't get me wrong, I love both, but the balance between those two is a tricky thing to get right, and Eyes staggers on that line for most of the film. It ultimately succeeds in winning me over, but I've always acknowledged that Eyes is one of the more problematic entries in the series, and the opening is a good example of that. The film reminds us of one of the most emotional and downbeat finales in the series, and then proceeds to make a joke out of Blofeld's final demise. Granted, it is funnier than either View's or Moonraker's efforts to lighten the mood in their sequences, but when the whole thing is over, you realize that Bond's revenge for Tracy involved patting Blofeld on the head and dropping him down a chimney. It's a little underwhelming when viewed in context with the series, though on its own, there's a lot to love, especially that helicopter action.
It's time to get out.
One of the big problems most people have with Quantum of Solace is how it fails at being a proper follow-up to Casino Royale. Sometimes the reasoning is that the film is underbaked in its plot and characters, and at other times it's because the film is annoyingly copying from either Royale or the Bourne films on certain things. One of those elements is present and accounted for in the opening car chase, the shaky cam and fast editing, but I can honestly say that this is one place where I think Quantum is at its best. Picking up directly after Royale, Bond is transporting Mr. White to an MI6 safe house for interrogation. With enemy agents pursuing, Bond is in a gadgetless car having to evade their bullets. But the sequence opens up literally when Bond's side door gets torn off and we start encountering near misses with oncoming traffic, a police convoy, and a rock quarry. This is an exciting and fast-paced opening, perfectly setting the stage for Quantum's speedy vibe. So what's my issue? Well, it feels a little pedestrian of an action sequence for a Bond film. Granted, Craig's era was all about grounding the action, and sometimes that meant more rudimentary setups, but I feel like the other pre-title sequences of Craig's run still managed to feel appropriately Bondian without sacrificing that foundation. The one really stylish thing Bond does is shoot the other car, and I feel like it's the editing that gives it the style and not the actual act. I just wish there were one or two other moments like this through the rest of the sequence, though I do love Bond's quip at the very end.
I'm stabilizing Ronson.
We don't have the time.
I have to stop the bleeding.
Leave him.
Skyfall's opening is a behemoth of a scene, constantly moving, constantly evolving, and constantly developing character and plot. It can be a stunner of a sequence, especially with the ending pulling off another instance of Bond dying in the opening few minutes. A lot of the staging of the sequence is excellent. The dialogue between MI6 and the agents really reminds me of some of the great Bond video games in the past that did the same thing. Plus, it has some appropriately great Bondian touches, such as using the crane to change carriages. I personally feel like the sequence runs a little too long. Action is good, but constant action without downtime becomes noise, and Skyfall's opening is definitely in danger of crossing that line. And also, I feel like the whole thing is so grounded in scope that each segment of the chase pales in comparison with past action scenes. For example, Bond fighting on top of a train has been done before, but when Octopussy did it, it had Bond climbing around the outside, going underneath the carriages, fighting hand-to-hand against a guy with a sword, the whole shebang. Skyfall has some guys shooting at each other, using a crane, and then a fight on top using a chain. It's a little muted in comparison. Yet these are minor points. Skyfall gets started on a solid foot with its more involved story, and I applaud the ambition of the sequence, even if I think the execution's a little wobbly.
Alla morte. Alla morte.
Bottoms up.
As many of you likely know, Spectre is one of my least favorite films in the series. But my mantra has always been that no Bond film is without merit, and I don't mean the weakest films just have one or two small things to like. I mean every film has something truly awesome or noteworthy that makes it worth a watch, and the opening to Spectre is a perfect example of this. Sure, a lot of the praise goes towards the continuous shot, but there's more to it than that. We get mystery, a debonair lead, sex, danger, and a wonderful progression from beginning to end. This intro was originally meant to be a non-stop action fest after the explosion, much like Skyfall's, but Craig's leg injury necessitated part of the chase needed to be changed so that Bond pursues Sciarra slowly through a crowd. I think this was a serendipitous bit of luck for the scene. It keeps the chase from getting stale. Plus, the fight on the helicopter, while reminiscent of other helicopter fights in the series, does just enough to make it its own thing. For a movie that I think can get exceptionally dull at times, this is one bit where I'm fully engrossed with what's going on, and it gets my hopes up every time that I will finally come around on this one.
Don't blow it all at once.
Oh, I have special plans for this consignment.
Back-to-back perpetual dogged-on entries here. Isn't it interesting that some of the weaker films have some great pre-credit sequences? Die Another Day gets the film started off right by going bombastic without losing the sense of the personal stakes, despite having one of the longer openings. Bond has been caught during an assassination mission, his escape route cut off, and he is sentenced to death. But a timely explosion from a Q device gives Bond a reprieve. While he is fully aware he's probably not getting out of this one unscathed, Bond still proceeds with the mission to take out Colonel Moon by hopping on a hovercraft. What follows is a wonderful chase in the classic Brosnan tradition. Landmines to dodge, other hovercrafts pursuing, and then a tense fight with Bond and Moon when he catches up with him. It's all great stuff. I've always said this film was the precursor to Skyfall, and there's yet another connection in this sequence. Both openings end with an unusual twist. Here Bond gets recaptured and is tortured. The film lulls you into thinking this is going to be one of the more grim, down-to-earth spy stories, something Brosnan hasn't had since GoldenEye, but the film obviously makes a dramatic shift later. I know a good few people who, even though they deride the film as a whole, are quite firm in their belief that the opening of Die Another Day is a highlight of Brosnan's run, and I quite agree. The final thing that I love is that, unlike another film we'll be discussing later, it was actually constructed to be this long, rather than a restructuring of a few scenes to serve as an opening. Nothing feels unnatural in the build-up, and that's what serves to place it here.
Filthy habit.
I'm actually kind of bummed that Tomorrow Never Dies ranked this low, and that's saying something because it barely misses out on being in the top 10. Another big explosion fest, it's a perfect short story of a scene. You don't need much to get what's going on and why this arms fest needs to be stopped. But then we are given a ticking clock to a nuclear disaster, and Bond kicks in the high gear, setting off explosions, taking down people with only a punch or two, and firing a machine gun while looking so dashing and confident. He then takes off in a jet with the bombs, which might have been a fine place to end the scene. However, another jet gets behind him, and to top it off, Bond has a backseat driver. This is all terrifically fun and perfectly sets the tone of the adventure. The nitpick I have is that the ticking clock element is a bit contrived. Not only are the Admiralty a little too quick to send a missile in without giving Bond much of a chance to escape, but soon after the launch, the missile gets too far out of range for self-destruction. It seems odd to me that this happens so soon, and it only serves to paint the Admiralty as trigger-happy. Granted, that aspect is a feature of the main plot, but I kinda hate crapping on command so early in the film. Regardless, this is a wonderful intro to the movie and a great shot of adrenaline.
Good morning. My name's Bond. James Bond. Miss,
Majesty's opening is driven by two forces, getting started right away with signaling a new kind of film and introducing a new Bond. I think it succeeds wildly at the first and somewhat stumbles at the second. There's a lot to love here. Lazenby is introduced in silhouette, so we're not so distracted so as to not pay attention to what's going on with Tracy. We realize about when Bond does what she's doing, and he doesn't hesitate to save her from drowning. Tracy is mostly lifeless at this point, a wonderful move on Diana Rigg's part, and Lazenby seems matter-of-fact and a bit more confident than we might expect a new Bond to be. And following it up with a fight with some thugs shows promise in cementing Lazenby in the role before we get to the title song. However, some of the editing gets in the way of fully appreciating what's going on. Also, compared to some of the introduction sequences for later Bonds, a fight on the beach isn't the most glamorous or clearest of ways to show what kind of a Bond Lazenby is. This demonstrates that the film is fully committed to doing something different with its story, while mostly just carrying on with a new Bond, which I think sums up the film very well. My big hang-up is I wish Lazenby came through a bit stronger here, but other than that, I think this is a wonderful change of pace from the previous 4 pre-credit sequences, and definitely one to remember.
There's something I need to tell you.
I bet there is.
The longest and most ambitious of the pre-titles, No Time to Die is certainly in danger of overstaying its welcome. But I'm won over on a few features. 1, the flashback with Safin and Madeline is suitably creepy and sets up a lot of the coming relationship between the two. 2, Bond and Madeline get a chance to win me over on a relationship I didn't care for previously, and they nearly managed to do that. They are a bit sabotaged by the reuse of We Have All the Time in the World's melody. 3, it really sets the foundation of the film's themes and makes it crystal clear that no matter how it ends, this really feels like the last Craig adventure. And 4, it features a grand car chase with a gadget-laden DB5 with one of the most grin-inducing escapes I've seen in this series. I do get the complaint that it runs too long, as that's an issue I've had with some of the other pre-title sequences. But that complaint gets dropped by me when I try to consider where I would have cut off the sequence. Placing the titles over the 5-year passage feels like the most natural place, and it echoes both GoldenEye and Die Another Day, which also had their credits denote the passage of time. Anywhere else, it's jarring. And given the film's ambition and all that it's trying to do, I really can't offer a better suggestion for how to condense this sequence without substantially rewriting the rest of the film. Plus, I think the scenes flow very well together, to the point where I'm not even thinking about looking at my watch. For my money, No Time to Die absolutely nails most of its goals in the opening 20 minutes, and I've rewatched just this part of the film many times in isolation, so that's gotta count for something.
Well, it's a small world. You're a Toro too.
Interrogación. Sí, coronel. Métanlo al camión.
From this point onward, we get into the top tier of pre-titles, meaning any of these are worthy of the top 3, but there are just too many contenders. The most detached from its respective film, Octopussy's opening is a blast. A self-contained mini-mission featuring one of the best aircraft from the series, this one hits all the beats you'd want from a Bond opening. It really has nothing to do with the plot of the film, even in a small tangential way. It could have served as the opening to any other entry, but that's also what gives it its uniqueness. If you want a complete sequence of Bondian action without any lingering threads to a subsequent adventure, then this is the one to pick. Right away, I know what kind of film this is going to be, I know how Roger's going to play the role, and I get a sense of what great action will come later. I really don't know what else I can say about this one. Much like Tomorrow Never Dies, I think Octopussy's first few minutes are a great representation of that free sample marketing I talked about in the intro to this video. If you aren't won over by the time Moore pulls up to the gas station and asks for a refill, then this film is not for you. Also, I have to ask, why do you hate fun?
The second is...
Yes. Considerably.
Various films have made statements about themselves in pretty dramatic ways, but none quite like Casino Royale from 2006. It's not only introducing a new Bond, but it's the clearest way to show that this is the beginning of the man's career, a clear tonal and story reboot. I too miss the times of days gone by with Roger Moore's or Sean Connery's mostly standalone adventures that embrace the ridiculousness of their material, but I've rarely seen a more attention-grabbing introduction for a Bond film than this one. Craig perfectly establishes what kind of Bond he is at the moment, and it does a lot to clear away the preconceptions we might bring with this by this being a James Bond film. It's a ridiculously economical scene, being second only to From Russia with Love in terms of length for the official series openings, and the only reason it isn't higher is because I enjoy the rest a bit more. But for what it is, this is a dynamite way to open my favorite Bond film of them all.
Forgive me.
Why do you always wear that thing?
I have a slight inferiority complex. Where was I? Oh, yes.
While From Russia with Love introduced the precedent for the pre-title sequences, Goldfinger is the one that codified it and set forth the standard. In the words of director Guy Hamilton, it's a wonderful piece of nonsense. It sets up Connery as the gallant and stylish hero whose mind is always on the mission first, shows off the film's tongue-in-cheek attitude towards its material, and invites you to have fun while taking none of the material that seriously. While I do prefer Bond a bit more down to earth, this is such an irresistible treat. Virtually all of it is iconic now. The duck on Bond's head, the suit underneath the wetsuit, Bond smoking as an explosion goes off, Bond just strolling into a room with a woman bathing, the reflection of the villain in the eye, and the one-liner to close off the scene. It's so self-contained, much like the Octopussy opening. In fact, the only real connection it has to the rest of the film is it shows why Bond is in Miami. Goldfinger's opening is the perfect encapsulation of what Connery's Bond is, and it's hard not to smile when watching it.
Expenses. Voilà, la receipt.
Would you like to check my figures?
Oh, I'm sure they're perfectly rounded.
Yeah, this won't come as a surprise to anyone. The World Is Not Enough often tops lists of pre-title sequences, and for good reason. However, I couldn't quite place it at the top of mine. Hear me out, folks. Upon rewatching this sequence, I realized what my issue was with it when comparing it to the rest. The boat chase is underserved by what precedes it. Many of you likely know that at one time the bank action may have been the whole pre-title sequence. While I agree with Michael Lapton and crew that it would have been underwhelming if it was left to just that, especially with a spectacular boat chase coming, that doesn't mean that there aren't still some lingering issues. The bank bit is covering a bit of plot setup, but I feel like the crew could have made the action more impactful and it just gets lost in the great action scenes in the movie. However, the greater crime is committed by the MI6 briefing in between. It slows the film down too much, showing you some of the recognizable tropes of older films before launching right back into the action. Maybe if they had managed to keep up some building tension, that may have helped to make the sequence feel like a more cohesive whole, like each bit was building on top of each other, rather than feeling re-edited to connect two different action bits. Instead, the sequence takes too much of a breath and then just goes right back to 11 in the thrill department. It's jarring. All that said, I have virtually no notes on the boat chase. It is one of the most terrific action scenes I've ever seen in a Bond film. It's exciting, it's well-paced, it's tense, it's funny, and not a moment is wasted. If the lead up to it was a bit better, I very well could have placed this right at the top.
It's all so boring here, Margot. There's nothing but playboys and tennis pros. If only I could find a real man.
Chalk this one up to me being younger than you, I don't care. Timothy Dalton's duology had some of the best pre-title sequences ever, and The Living Daylights lives up to the standards set by both Goldfinger and Russia in combining the two styles. It's obviously not the best at this as far as I'm concerned, but it's hard not to see this as a top-tier introduction. The dangerous mystery is laid out right up front. There's a bit of playing with the audience's expectations as to when we will see the new Bond. Dalton's first shot is terrific, the music is spectacular, and we get one heck of an action scene with Dalton right there doing most of the work himself. Daylights is more serious on the whole in comparison to the previous Moore films, but it doesn't go quite as far as License to Kill. In fact, there are still animal reactions, clueless pedestrians, and even a bored woman on a yacht. With the exception of Connery's intro, the series hadn't quite nailed how to introduce a new Bond to the public yet, and our first glimpse of Dalton guides us right into its new take on the character while making a big impression. It's nearly perfect.
Beg your pardon? Forgot to knock.
What the hell are you doing? Let's go fishing!
I'm gonna cheat here a bit. This was the hardest battle between two sequences on this list, and so I'm forced to call my first tie. Both have amazing action. Both set the stage for the upcoming films nearly perfectly on both the character and story side, and both feature favorite Bonds of mine at peak performance. License to Kill introduces almost all the main players for the story, offers a clear tonal statement just like Casino Royale would do 17 years later, has Dalton handling most of his own stunts and offering a considerate performance, and features my favorite cinematic version of the Bond theme over an amazing bit of aerial work. The GoldenEye sequence introduces Brosnan, who just oozes both a classic and updated Bond at the same time, features two 00s on a mission together, and delivers Bond a gut punch right up front with losing a friend, as well as one of the single best stunts in all of Bond right at the beginning. Every time I think one entry might have the edge over the other, I find something else to swing the pendulum and leave me bouncing back and forth between them. So I'm forced to call it like it is for me. Both License to Kill and GoldenEye deserve to be in the top 3, and yet I cannot decide where I land precisely on them. But hey, what a great dilemma to encounter for this list.
But James, I need you.
So does England.
Sometimes the classics have earned their status for a reason. Here, The Spy Who Loved Me wins hands down. Why? Because no other film is better at its presentation. Every other film has something that holds me back from wholly embracing it, from the most minor of quibbles to larger issues. Here, I can't find anything wrong with it. The hijacking of the submarine is done just right. We don't see the Leparis or know anything about the sub from the start. We are then told it's a nuclear sub right after, which gives us the weight of the situation. It's then amplified by switching to General Gogol being informed about the loss of an equivalent Russian sub. He then calls for his best agent, Triple X, who we think might be the Bondian-looking Michael Billington, but we find it is the woman in bed, Anya. We then switch to M, who receives a similar phone call to Gogol, who sends for 007. Bond, in bed with a woman from another assignment, receives the call to action and doesn't hesitate to march right out. We then get possibly the best ski sequence in the series, interlaced with the plot development of the death of Anya's boyfriend and some of the best music in the film. After some cooler than cool moves, the filmmakers pull out their ace in the hole. Bond skis off the side of the mountain and opens a Union Jack parachute, and the crowd goes wild. The progression of this opening is sheer perfection, and I have yet to see someone not get thrills from it. Roger's not my favorite Bond, nor is Spy my favorite movie from his run, but I'd be lying if I said I thought there was a better and more Bondian opening sequence than this. So many others have come close to matching this one, but no one has yet topped it for me. Is there any other aspect of this series that has been done as consistently well as the pre-titles? There are certainly weaker ones, and I may have sounded a little harsh on a few, but they still run circles around most other movies and have a lot of good things going for them. Not one pre-title sequence has failed to interest me in its subsequent adventure in some way. Several other film franchises have their own unique ways of beginning their movies, from the Star Wars opening crawl to the Pink Panther's hilarious opening credits. But when it comes to a complete package, a typical Bond film gives you the most bang for your buck, usually a gun barrel, a pre-title sequence, and a provocative set of musical titles. I'll get to talking more in depth about those other two aspects in the coming year, but of these three elements, the pre-title sequences are the group that I get the most out of. They serve as a comforting reassurance that this franchise knows how important first impressions are, and Bond has rarely failed to deliver some of the best and most appetizing scenes to grace the opening of a movie.